Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for parting yourselves from lunch and everything else and coming to listen to us this afternoon. I'm conscious that quite a lot of our focus here, and particularly the vehicles, make this a sort of land-orientated event. And it's important to realise that the enablers of land warfare came of age in the Second World War, and that is air warfare. And we know an awful lot about the American Air Force, we know a lot about the Royal Air Force for very obvious reasons. It struck us that we know remarkably little about what makes the Luftwaffe tick. Last night we had a wonderful, entertaining display of the kit, the machinery. But I think we need to dig deeper to find out what the Luftwaffe personnel thought and what their motivations were, and how they interacted with their aircraft, and how those aircraft were the result of developments in the Second World War. And just one instance we were talking about before we began, the night fighting was not on anybody's metaphorical radar in 1939, and yet the Germans are crack night fighters by 1944. So what I'm going to do is now introduce Jens and Christoph to you. They're going to talk a little about their own background and expertise to give you a flavour of where their strengths are. I'm going to throw in the odd question, but my job is really just as a chairman, so if you hear too much from me, a lot of booing and hissing, please, because their job is to enlighten you and entertain you. And as they were both telling me before we began, there's almost no research being done into the Luftwaffe, apart from the planes themselves, during the Second World War or the Third Reich period. So what you're being treated to this afternoon is cutting edge stuff from people who have spent their lives looking in the archives. Both are in print. And there will be a book signing after this afternoon's presentation. So, Jens and Christoph, welcome. Thank you very much for being here. And if I can ask you both to introduce yourselves, and once you've finished up, I'm then going to throw the first question at you, and we'll see where we go from there. We'll chat for about 45 minutes. And then I will look meaningfully at you. Hopefully we will have stirred some interest and some questions. And those of you who are still awake may be able to respond with a few questions, and we will see where this takes us. So, without further ado.
Yeah, my name is Jens Wehner. I'm a military historian from Germany. And I work professional as a military curator at the Museum of the Armed German Forces in Dresden. But recently I have done a PhD about the German fighter force in World War II, and that's the reason why I am sitting here currently and talking to you about the Luftwaffe.
Yeah, my name is Christoph Bergs. I'm currently a PhD student at King's College, and on the part-time, I have this YouTube channel. It's called Military Aviation History. Some of you might have seen it at some point. And yeah, I focus sort of on the Luftwaffe side, the development of the structures of close air support, sort of starting even in the late 1930s and then going, of course, through the war all the way to the end, and how those structures sort of developed, and why the Luftwaffe was, in fact, not necessarily the forerunner of close air support that is often being said.
Good, so there's our starter, and I'm going to be very unkind and throw in a really difficult question, but I hope you'll see the logic of my idea. So what I want to start by exploring was the Luftwaffe any good? Because obviously they're on the losing side. There's a lot of influence, but from that we can then dig deep down. So if I can throw such a general question in the form of darts at you, would you like to respond to that first?
I would respond with 3 points. First, I don't know for sure. Second,
You can tell he's a diplomatic, official military historian.
Second, actually, I had this question in the research, in the documents, when I found a quota from Hermann Göring in 1944, where he was very angry with the Luftwaffe at this point. I think who knows the history of World War II knows why he was angry with the Luftwaffe. And he said in his anger that the Luftwaffe at the beginning of the war was nothing special, with the exception of the dive bomber. And so I would say in some kinds this statement is true. And when it comes to the dive bomber, I would hand it over to Chris because he is the dive bomber expert, the two of us.
Well, I think basically what we should also think about that question is good in what sense? Because in certain sense, the Luftwaffe was absolutely nothing special. It was an air force that was created out of nothing, which still had, in many ways, things to overcome that other air forces had already overcome those challenges. But there were some innovative ideas, not always applied very well. So with dive bombers, for example, we think of them as sort of this instrument of close air support and immediately going in with the army, just hitting the positions, the army rolls in. And we've all seen the propaganda material. But really what the Germans were thinking about the dive bomber, well, it's just a more accurate bomber. And they fold them into their bomber force, and they are supposed to hit the exact same targets, just with a little bit more precision, a little bit more accuracy, and just go from there. And it's all going to be sort of interdiction support and so on and so forth. So in that sense, I think what we see immediately with the operations in Poland is that the conceptual idea, the doctrine of the Luftwaffe, was not that different from other air forces and not that special, but it's the experiences that come out of these conflicts that do create a force that in small tactical engagements does have a certain strength to it that perhaps we're not seeing in this early war time. And in that sense, I would say, well, yes, the Luftwaffe did a good job in those engagements, but as a whole force, there were so many struggles with this force still, so many challenges that it's a valid question. Like, where was it any good, but in what sense?
Yeah, I would say they had some strength and they had, of course, some weaknesses. And one big weakness of the Luftwaffe was that it was not able really to learn as an institution. So they made the mistakes all over the war. Let's say it like this. I found it in my PhD, only in 1944 there is a more reflected way of thinking about their own doctrines and why they not work. Because you have to imagine the doctrines of the Luftwaffe since 1935 never changed until the end of the war. So officially. On the other side, and this is the other part, they were very flexible and learnable on the lower levels of officer corps. Yeah? So lieutenants, captains, majors were highly adaptable in applying new tactics. And this is one of the reasons why the whole Luftwaffe as an institution was still working somehow in 1943 and 44. In 44, I would say it was over. They couldn't fix it anymore with this provisional measurements they invented. Yeah. But until then, it was working because they had a high initiative of the low levels. Let's say it like this.
Right, so let's try another direction which has just occurred to me, which is that those of you who know anything about the Luftwaffe will know that Hermann Göring had an obsession with the word air, and if the word air was in the title, Luft, or you had anything to do with aircraft, then he wanted you as part of his organisation, even down to a Hermann Göring Panzer Division, which is completely irrelevant. Do the Luftwaffe lose out because they are stretched in the direction of Fallschirmjäger, paratroopers, which aren't part of anyone else's airport, of air defence, all those anti-aircraft guns, which don't help their development of flight and pilot training and tactics?
Interestingly, if you look in the 30s, when there was peace, some kind, except of the Spanish Civil War and so on, then one really stunning note is that the Luftwaffe spent as much money, nearly as much money for buildings, for really good buildings, like the Reichsluftfahrtministerium or the Luftgau in Dresden, that were really like palaces or something like this, as for airplanes. So you see the Luftwaffe, I would say from this point of view, they not always had the right Schwerpunkt, let's say it like this, in their armament and in their thinking and in their air-mindedness, because it was really important for the Luftwaffe to be the most important arm of the Wehrmacht and the National Socialist Wehrmacht, yeah, because you have the head, Göring, which was also not only the head of the Luftwaffe, but most importantly, the political leader of the Nazi party. And so you see very much money was transferred to.
Yeah, so traditionally we say the Luftwaffe is a creature of National Socialism, and the army originates from the sort of Weimar Republic and earlier, and then the navy is the Kaiser's navy. So each of the armed forces has a different background, and that's a very conscious decision from Göring and the Luftwaffe.
And recent research in Germany from my colleague Magnus Pahl and some others regarding the Fallschirmjäger shows that they were very political. They were directly from the Sturmabteilung SA or from the police, and this was even quality matters on personnel didn't matter for them. Mostly they were a political force. At least the indicators are like this. But when it comes to the fighting airplanes, then it's, I would say, a little bit a different story, because there you can't take, let's say, 40-year-old officer from the police with a belly and sit it in a 109 or so. This is not really useful. But when it comes to the Fallschirmjägers, there you see the political function of the Luftwaffe in the Third Reich clearly.
I think we do see it a little bit with sort of the build-up of the Luftwaffe. So as obviously we have we already have before, of course, Hitler takes power in the 1920s, we have sort of this small reserve force that is being built up, and small fighter planes being, camouflaged as a civilian aircraft. And there is sort of a standing force. But in order to then change that over to the Luftwaffe, it's a massive project. You have to build up the infrastructure, you have to build up the institutions, and of course you have to build up the fleet as well. So in that sense, you are drawing in a lot of people that perhaps, as you were saying, have sort of that history and that don't necessarily are fully on board with everything that is going ideologically, although that is still up to discussion as well in some regard. But as you see sort of the recruitment coming in and sort of the setup of these flying schools as well with younger people, then definitely we're starting to see sort of also a change in mentality in the Luftwaffe. But it stays, I think, quite a contentious subject until the end of the war. And even after the war, we have this idea of, the Luftwaffe was not necessarily the most National Socialist of forces, although I think that nowadays, I think Victoria Taylor had a talk last year on this as well, has been shown not necessarily to be the case. They were very much on board with the ideology as well.
So let's go to combat, but let's go to the Luftwaffe's first combat, which is not anyone else's really, and the Spanish Civil War. And what difference does that make to the direction of travel, where the Luftwaffe is going, its doctrine, its personnel?
I mean, I would say for my sort of research subject, it did very little. So looking at sort of close air support and looking at how the experiences of the Spanish Civil War shaped the Luftwaffe in that regard, not that much changed. So there was still the sort of the bomber primacy and all these sort of experiences that were made with ground attack using either Stukas or even fighter planes, improvised bomb apparatuses to drop 10-kilogram bombs. Not much more than grenades, but back then it was something new. It was the people on the ground were obviously quite scared of this new weapon coming over, dropping bombs, strafing them. In that sense, we start sort of seeing the first reports coming in. Maybe the Luftwaffe should invest in something that is a close air support aircraft. And we do see the result of that then coming out in the 1930s, 40s with the Henschel 129. But initially, that really is sort of a subject that the Luftwaffe doesn't want to touch that much. And even there's I believe, sort of a lexicon that comes out in 1939 about everything to do with aviation. Göring's signature in it as well is sanctioned at the official level. And a close air support aircraft there is, quote, a controversial aircraft that we don't really invest time and effort in. And then, of course, you have the startup with the operations against Poland. And of the Luftwaffe fleet, which is considerable, I think it was 2,500 aircraft more or less, not all operational, of course. how many aircraft are actually kitted out to do close air support? It's 40. It's Henshaw 123s, old biplanes, and the reason why they have them is because this aircraft was considered not good enough for dive bombing. And the factory production line has been shut down, and all these 40 aircraft is all they have. And it's only with the fighting in Poland that they discover, well, we have this Stuka thing, and the army keeps screaming at us to deliver, close air support, but we can't really do it with the aircraft that we have. And it's too late at this point to immediately make a change, but we do see that coming out sort of, especially on the Eastern Front in the 1940s.
Yeah, when it comes to the Spanish War, I would say the Luftwaffe learned something what was really helpful. They learned something that was wrong, and they learned something not really because they ignored it. Let's start with the last point. It's what Chris already said. They ignored their experience about the bombers. The bombers were not really efficient in Spanish Civil War. Also, the Soviet bombers were easy prey for the German fighters, but they still thought the bombers would be very good in the air combat. So they learned nothing. They just ignored it, although there were reports showing those problems. Okay. Second point, they learned the wrong side. This is especially true for the AAA and the 88mm gun, which was highly efficient in Spanish Civil War for several reasons, but not in World War II. And so they thought AAA would be very efficient to counter a bomber offensive or something like this. So AAA was always important for the Luftwaffe, and the Spanish Civil War gave them another impression in this direction. So I would say this is a wrong learning from the Civil War. And right learning, or let's say a helpful learning, were of course the fighter tactics, which were developed new in Spanish Civil War by Günter Lützow and Werner Mölders. And they gave the Luftwaffe fighters some advantage in the early fights of World War II, 1939 in the 40s. Yeah.
So what I'm getting the impression that what we're saying is that when the European war breaks out in 1939 and over Poland and then with France, the developments then really come as quite a shock to the Luftwaffe in terms of the battle that they then have to fight.
Should have, but didn't, because they ignored the experiences. For instance, Poland, they destroyed 7% of all Polish planes on the ground. But they assumed, for instance, let's take Kesselring and others, they nearly completely destroyed on ground. And so they repeated their mistake every time. You can say even Bodenplatte in 1945 is in some kind a repeat of this mistake from 39. They never learned their lessons, and it was the same 1940 with the surprisingly air attack on the French airfields, which was a big failure, but the Luftwaffe didn't recognize this as a failure. They thought in some way we destroyed the French Air Force at the ground, yeah. And so yeah, as you say, should have been in shock, but wasn't because they didn't recognize it.
There's always sort of these small, as you actually said in one of your early instances, there's always these patchwork solutions that are being made by the Staffeln, by the Gruppen, in order to have tactical solutions to the problems that are appearing on the field. But in order to actually make a switch and turn the whole Luftwaffe around and just change the whole structure and the thinking, that never really happens. But I think one of the points that we should also talk about is that the Luftwaffe has so many different theaters it has to operate in and are completely different. The Eastern Front is completely different to the Western Front. The Battle of the Reich is completely different to either of those. Then we have Africa, which is still sort of this black hole in our research, where what does the Luftwaffe actually learn over Africa? Because some of their first instances of, for example, trying to change close air support occur in Africa, and we would know preciously little about that. But it's always sort of these unit level experiences that are being filtered upwards, being said, well, these are our solutions, can we work with them? And on top, it's always like, well, we have this idea of destroying an air force in a grand offensive in the first 48 hours, and then we'll sort of help the army and so on and so forth, and that never changes. And as you were saying, Operation Bodenplatte, it's right back to the Operation Poland.
So I'm getting a sense that there's no strategic vision at all, and a lot of what happens just develops or almost happens by accident. And I'm also wondering just how much, if you stretch the Luftwaffe, what is it capable of doing? It strikes me as there's really one force. I mean, the Mediterranean effort really goes to Russia once Russia starts, and there's very little left to stay in the Mediterranean. And likewise, the Germans are, they have one fighter force, and it can either stay in the West and oppose the Western Air Force, or it goes back to Germany to defend Germany from bombers. So, to what extent does the Luftwaffe suffer from just having, one central blob, if you like, that doesn't have separate taskings and separate capabilities?
I think one of the primary reasons for that problem is that if you compare it, for example, to the RAF or the American Army Air Force, there's very little, well, there is interaction between sort of the civilian side and the military side, but it's not on an eye level. In the RAF and in the USAF, we have the situation where the civilians and the military they get together, and the military say, we have these requirements, we need to get this done, how do we do this? And then the civilian side, the engineers and so on, they sort of work it out. And sometimes, I think even David Willey said it yesterday with the Sherman tank, the military is asked to leave the room, while the civilian, the engineers, the technicians sort of hash out the solution to the problem and try to make those requirements that the army has, or in this case the Luftwaffe, a reality. Whereas in Germany, we have the civilian side that is really sort of pushed away from the development almost, is being treated in these silos, for these different silos about engines and even sort of the engine cooling, the radiator development, the weapons, so on, are always treated in these silos. There's very little interaction between them. So you never have really a situation where the civilians can say, well, what you're asking us to do is impossible because we cannot connect all these things, and the aviation industry is probably one of the most sort of expertise-driven industries out there. It's always at the cutting edge, and that just never happens with the Luftwaffe. So we're sitting in the situation where the army always demands something and says, well, this has to be done, and you can see this quite clearly sort of in the discussions that are happening between at the high level of the Luftwaffe, Milch, and sort of some of the other generals, where they're saying, well, today we need this, so let's send it out in order to the industry of upping the production of DB601s by 50. And then 2 months later they say, well, actually we need those engines for another aircraft, not the one that we intended to. And then 2 months later they're like, why is the aircraft that we initially intended to have upped production with the engines, why don't those engines exist? Oh yeah, we will change the order. So it always sort of is fragmented, yeah.
The other side, and this leads to another discourse in the Luftwaffe, they are always thinking very technical. So every problem has in their mind a technical solution, while in reality it should be a military solution. Maybe it's not that your bomber is that bad, maybe it's your doctrine. But they never think about this. It's interestingly that the Luftwaffe was not good in military thinking, in their reflection, and so they transferred a lot of problems into the technology, and this leads to some of these projects which failed, which are, I think, a little bit common, like the He 177, so the big strategic bomber of the Luftwaffe, the Heinkel 177, which was a big failure and so on, because they overestimated the potential of the technology, and they thought everything we make wrong is because we have the wrong technology, or the wrong planes, or whatever, or the wrong weapons. One other example for this, when the Americans started their bomber offensive, this was a huge problem for the Luftwaffe because their fighters were very inefficient. And what did they thought at first? We have to strengthen our armament. So they tried to hang on bigger cannons and bombs at the airplanes and so on. And only after 1.5 up to 2 years, they learned it's the tactics. they were more efficient over the time with changing the tactics, but the armament had not really a big role in this. So you see their technological mind thinking on problem solutions.
Now, to what extent does this rely on the leadership of Hermann Göring? Because he is a First World War fighter ace with, 29 victories, then leaves the air service and doesn't reappear until the Luftwaffe is founded in 1935, by which time he's suddenly been elevated from, what was he, a captain when he leaves, to Field Marshal, and eventually Reichsmarshal, the world's only 6-star general. And yet he's had no intermediate training of staff colleges or any concept of higher leadership at all that all his opponents would have done. So all the Allied air commanders have been through this career path as professionals, but Göring hasn't. Is the chaotic nature we've just been discussing, is that a reflection of Göring himself?
To a part, I would say yes, but he's not the only one in the Luftwaffe who is like this, And let's say it like this: the Luftwaffe had some thinking in the Reichswehr in the 20s, and they were, I would say, quite reasonable about the abilities of technology and how to use technology. And they had a doctrine called Standardtypen, so standard types of airplanes. So you have a fighter and you have always a state-of-the-art fighter, not 2 or 3 different models, but one. And actually, to my impression, they changed it after the Battle of Britain, because they thought we lost the Battle of Britain because of our bad technology, which you can still find in the research if you read some really established academics. I don't want to call any names. They say, the Luftwaffe, they had bad bombers, and that's the reason why they lost the Battle of Britain. And that's because that was the Luftwaffe thought. But I would say this is not the case. They lost because of their bad doctrine, because of their false assumptions they had, And so they had a quite reasonable base, I would say, when they started in 1933 with Göring. But officially it was 1935. And just one thing, if you look at the general staff of the Luftwaffe, which is the brain of the military, let's say it like this, the general staff is always the brain. In the 30s, no one wanted to be the head of the general staff. So they had really to try to find anybody who wants to be, and it turned out it was Ježonek, who was at this point colonel. And he became the head of the general staff and was promoted every year. He got a new rank in general. At the end, he was general colonel or something like this, I think. But in the beginning, he was only a colonel, because Kesselring, Stumpf, and one another, they didn't want it to be the head of the general staff. They all wanted to be a commanding officer at the front or something like this. So Kesselring wanted to be the head of a Luftflotte, to make a battle, to be the head of a battle.
And a lot of them had come from the army, not the German Imperial Air Service.
Yeah, if it comes to Kesselring, is a artillery officer, And Kesselring is I would say, I'm not so much into the officers and generals, but Kesselring, I would say, is a good example for my thesis, because as you know, I think in the Battle of Britain, the Zerstörer, the Messerschmitt 110, had really a quite bad performance. And Kesselring even wrote after the war he didn't understand why. He wrote in his memoirs. It's not a letter or something like this. You can read it in his memoirs. So and you
they're
see
looking
that
at the technical problems all the time. And
they look.
Doctrine.
And if they look.
It's also with the wrong assumptions that you said. We see this also with air defense. So they believe that the flak primacy that we see in the Luftwaffe during certain periods, that alone is going to sort of prevent the bomber streams coming in, that shoots enough airplanes, and that's going to be the only defense that you need. And not recognizing some of the technologies that are out there that could potentially, if you integrate it into your air defenses, that is going to do a lot of sort of good for the Luftwaffe. in the sense of allowing you to observe the airspace. And specifically, I'm of course pointing at radar here, because the radar sets that the Germans had in 1940, when the Battle of Britain happened, so Würzburg and Freya, are actually pretty good. They're second generation radar sets compared to what the RAF has or what Britain has with chain home. And it provides, for example, the capability of tracking an aircraft, having sort of the position relayed to the actual AA guns, and the AA guns tracking it automatically and shooting at it. And they shoot down their first aircraft in May 1940 doing this. But because there's very little sort of technical appreciation at the higher level of what radar actually allows you to do.
Or integrating the system.
Exactly, the system. And it's all sort of, again, these small units, they're highly capable, they're trained in their use of radar and their weapon systems. They know what those weapon systems are capable of, but it's sort of the higher level that doesn't really understand that and can't draw the right conclusions from it, and specifically now on air defense, of course.
So I see James Holland is not in the room, which is a good thing, and there's a sort of frisson now, because we've skirted around the Battle of Britain. So I'm going to ask the question I know you all want to ask, which is, why did the Germans lose the Battle of Britain, and when did they realize that that had happened?
I think they lost because of their wrong doctrines, which they already applied in Poland and France. And as I said, they never recognized it, because in Poland and France, they had the army, the ground forces, that conquered the enemy airfields, and so the air war was won. But this was not possible with the British islands, and so, yeah, they lost. And you can see it, they bombed British airfields, and they had assumptions that this would destroy the RAF or the fighter command at the ground. And later on, General Deichmann, for instance, which was a high commander during the Battle of Britain, wrote in his memoirs that at one time a British airfield has over 200 hits of bombs. And no, it was a command station of the fighter command, had a hit of over 200 bombs, and 2 hours later it was ready again. Yeah, so, and this is a general overestimation about the effectiveness of bombs on the ground. I think also other air forces had it, but for the Germans in the first stage of the war, this is most important because they were on the offensive part, where they mostly used bombers and bombs. And you can see it also with the bombing of London, where they had the assumption that some bombing raids will make the Britons to give up, which was wrong. And then they started the so-called Jagdbomber, fighter hunter, with only one bomb. And Ježonek said to one high commander, the next bomb could be the last, because then the bottle is full. It's a German saying, I don't want to translate it. The bottle is full, and then the British guys will give up. So they had really the belief every bomb will help to make the British give up. So they had a high belief in bombs and their effectiveness on the ground, which wasn't the case. But to give a little bit a note on this, I would say it was the same, more or less, with the RAF or the Americans, which also had a high belief on bombers and their effectiveness on the ground. So this was not unique for the Luftwaffe, but this is really important for the first stage of the war, where the Luftwaffe was on the offensive, where they dropped mostly bombs.
The point we might make from the sort of British point of view is that RAF and Allied intelligence is very, very good in terms of aerial photo recce and understanding the damage they're doing. And what you're telling me is that the Luftwaffe intelligence, perhaps because there are so many different intelligence arms that are competing even within the Luftwaffe, is nothing like as good. So they think they're doing far more damage.
Yeah, I think it's a general thing of military air thinking in the 20s and 30s, yeah? Because if you remind General Duhet, he wrote that dropping 1,000 tons of bombs on London would erase the city. And this is obviously wrong, because London had much more bombs in World War II, and it still exists. So, but they had, sometimes I call it, to make it clear, they imagined it as a atomic war light, you know. So atomic war will, of course, erase the cities, Yeah, but this is the parallel. They assumed some days bombing a city will erase the city, and this is not the case. And so the same with factories, with airfields, with radar stations, and so on. And this is the wrong assumption the Luftwaffe had in the Battle of Britain. Yeah.
Yeah, they should have known this because we see this already being tried in Poland. We see this being tried in the operations against France, Operation Paula, right after Dunkirk, where they tried to hit all the airfields and knock out the Air Force and then just roll into France undisturbed. And they should have known that actually destroying an Air Force is incredibly difficult if you do not have that ground offensive that comes with it. And it is, as Jens was saying, it's an imaginary war in a sense, an imagined effect, which the Luftwaffe wasn't the only air force out there that was imagining the bomber to cleanse away all resistance. But that's probably the case also with the Battle of Britain. It was simply a wrong assumption and not drawing the right conclusions.
So this is really interesting. You know, the doctrine is now teaching us that the Luftwaffe were heading in the wrong directions and not even stopping to learn the conclusions they needed to pick up. But let's talk about the people now, the pilots, and some of the leaders, and their preparation and their training, and the amount of flying hours they have. What gives them the advantages they have to begin with, and then why does it tail off? Why do they fail at the end of the day?
Yeah, in the beginning, the Luftwaffe training was very non-institutional. It was highly on the squadrons because they didn't have the capacities and so on. So they had minor figures but high-quality pilots because the training in the squadron produced some highly trained pilots. But if you compared in the beginning of the war with the Polish fighters and the French fighters, I would say the training of the Luftwaffe wasn't that good as we assume today. There is even a calculation from, I think it's Robert Higham, who is a most air historian. He said that in the Battle of France in 1940, the most efficient pilots were the French, because they were the old one. They had many experience, many hours, and their planes weren't that bad. Even the Polish guys, I mean, there is a debate in Poland now about the kill figures of the Polish fighters, but I would say they fought 1 to 2, so meaning they lost 2 fighters for every kill, which is not that bad given the technology they had, the numbers that they had. So in the end, I would say the Luftwaffe wasn't that good in fighters trainings and tactics if you compare to the enemies of the peace air forces in 1939 and 1940. Over the war, it reached its peak, I would say, especially against the Soviet Union, which had badly trained pilots and badly applied tactics. This is the main reason, not the technology. And of course, due to the war, the Luftwaffe the fighter force at least, was broken, I would say, after the invasion, because
invasion of Russia.
No, the invasion, the D-Day. The D-Day. In Germany, we morely say invasion, but it's the D-Day. Yeah.
1944 is okay. That's
1944. Yeah, I would say after the D-Day. So I would say in August 44, there's the breaking point where the efficiency of the German fighters turned really bad, because up until then they had a 1-to-1 kill-loss ratio to my calculations, but afterwards it was 3-to-1.
And that is pilot hours training?
Yeah, pilot hours are difficult because, as Galland said, we had some pilots who weren't nearly able to take off or land, but were the best fighter aces. So, yeah, and this is, I don't know, I know it, I was once a sports glider pilot, and I know it for sure that there were some pilots in the glider sports who were the best pilots in flying big distances and using clouds and thermic, as we say in German, so the heat coming to the clouds and so on. But if you see them land, oh my God! So yeah, and so this means, of course, you can train soldiers and pilots very good, and they fulfill all the stuff you need to have for the training, but this doesn't necessarily mean they are good in fighting. And you have some German fighter aces, and I think the most important one, I would say, is Gerhard Barkhorn, which had officially 301 air kills, and he had really a slow start. He had also the need for classes a little bit, and he was short-sighted.
Yeah, 300 kills.
He was short-sighted, and I had the luck to see 160 kill claims from him, and it turned out that he shot around 50 meters at the enemy airplanes, 50, 60, 70 meters. With high speed coming, that close. And this means, because he was short-sighted, he needed to see
you can't make it up, can you?
the target. And so you see, it isn't necessarily that you have all the statistics on your side as a trained fighter pilot. You're a good flyer, you're a well-trained soldier, you're a good officer, whatever. In the end, it turned out it's only shown in the combat. And Barkhorn, I think he needed several hundred sorties for his first kill. So he had really a long run for his first success. And so you see, this was one of the strengths of the Luftwaffe, because we talked very much about the weaknesses, but this would not explain why the Luftwaffe was such an enemy over the war. And there you see one strength of the Luftwaffe, in my opinion. It tolerated some weaknesses, and it has a great sense for flexible ideas from the lower levels. And I think this is one of the strengths of the Luftwaffe.
I think also with the pilots, one of the things that I find interesting is how transferable the skills are between the different theaters. Because you do see a lot of pilots, they do a couple of months on the Eastern Front, fly their operations there, which are completely different to the defense of the Reich, and then they're being pulled to shoot down bombers, and they can't hit a thing. When they don't know how to approach these bombers, they don't know how to engage them, and their kill efficiency, if we want to call it like that, drops considerably. So there are pilots who, we all know sort of the kill list. You can even go on Wikipedia and you see the amount of German pilots that have like 300 kills, 200 kills, and so on and so forth. But if you look at where those kills happened, they oftentimes, with the majority of pilots, it's in one specific sort of theater, because they get very efficient there. And some of them might be great shots in the aircraft. They know exactly how to steer the aircraft, and they know exactly also when to engage and when not to engage. And if you have those skills in one theater, but then you're being transferred to another one, it might be that you just shot down on the first day.
That's fascinating. That really. Well, we've coasted through all sorts of different subjects, but I'm conscious that Time's Winged Chariot is at our heels. And I want to throw this open to you, because I'm sure there are some burning questions out there. So if we've got a roving mic, if we start back there.
Hi there. Can you say something about the influence of Luftwaffe on NATO Cold War Air Forces doctrine? Thinking about how the commanders kind of transferred into NATO air forces, and maybe also, Rudel and his, supposedly influencing the development of the A-10.
I'll do the Rudel stuff, because that's something I actually looked into. So Rudel, in my mind, has very limited influence on the A-10. There is sort of this, it's almost agreed amongst historians that Pierre Spray, who was of course instrumental in sort of getting the A-10 project off the ground, required all his engineers and everybody who was working on the A-10 to read Rudel's autobiography. Now, if you've read that book, I don't think it tells you much about how to design an aircraft to be good at tank busting. And also Rudel's experience comes from World War II, which is considerably different to what would have occurred during the Cold War. And Rudel is, I believe it's in 1974, he's invited to come to the US to speak at a conference, and I think it's called Anti-Tank Conference, and he's also shown the A-10. And upon being shown the A-10, he's asked for about 10 minutes, he's allowed to walk around the prototype, and then he's asked, what's your feedback? Well, he says, well, it's good it has a gun, because you need a gun. He says, it needs a second person in the back, because you need somebody to shoot down enemy aircraft that are attacking. Now, the early prototype of the A-10 actually did see sort of a second seat in the aircraft, but that wasn't necessary anymore. And then he says, well, it has to be incredibly slow, so propeller aircraft would perhaps be better. The plane is done, it's finished, it's right there. And also, if you look at sort of at the protocol of the conference, Rudel doesn't speak English. Everything is being translated, and I've looked at the German, I've looked at the English translation, and it's as if they're two different conferences. So whoever did the translation, I think I know who it is, but it's not written down in the conference paper, so I don't want to put out this hypothesis. But I think the person that did the translation got Rudel on board to have Rudel say what he wanted him to say, and when he didn't, well, nobody in the room spoke German, so you could just say, well, Rudel said this, and that means the A-10 is a great aircraft. So there you go.
I once met an old defense journalist from Germany who wrote in the 70s, and he told me that the idea of the American company that produced the A-10 used Rudel as advertising the plane in Germany, because they wanted Germany to buy the A-10. And this was really a bad idea, because Rudel was well known for being a national socialist, even in the 1970s, yeah. But I have seen German defense journals from the 70s where there is advertising from the company telling A-10, the new Stuka, So you see. So you see, I think this is where this comes from, yeah. And when it comes to the whole Luftwaffe, I'm not an expert on this, but if you look at the German research which is done on the modern Luftwaffe, then you see the Luftwaffe was Amerikanisiert, as we say in German, so it followed more or less the American rules and way of era. One very important example for this are the checklists. Checklists that are really common in the American air culture, let's say it like this, and the Germans didn't have it that way until 1945, and now they are common. So I would say that the Luftwaffe is more or less built after the American image of how an air force has to be.
Brilliant question, two brilliant answers.
Would it have made any difference if the material resources pumped into weird and wonderful aircraft and then the jet aircraft, if they'd have just put that money into manufacturing more of the proven fighter aircraft, or would pilot shortage have been more of a problem if that was the case?
I don't think it would have changed the outcome of the war. Theoretically speaking, I mean, if you look at, for example, the 262, the plans originate from that aircraft before the war starts. And they're sort of starting to develop it, and it's this project that they conceptualize as, well, we'll win the war, and then we put this aircraft into production, because obviously as you scale up production, you can't just switch it around, right? One of the things that I do find interesting in terms of production there is the efficiency, at least in terms of numbers, of pumping out those jet engines at the end of the war. So I think with the Jumo 04, we have like 6,000 examples of those being built, versus the actual aircraft that are supposed to carry them. So there's about 1,500 Me-262s being built, but only 400 of those actually go into operations, right, or are accepted. Of course, the build quality of those engines is very poor as well, but the amount of power you get out of it, in terms of how many man's hours are being spent on it, very efficient if you look at it on a spreadsheet in terms compared to piston engines. Because the quality of the production isn't up there, it probably doesn't have the impact. And if they had maybe switched it around earlier, yes, for sure, perhaps they could have had the 262 out a year earlier. Would it have that much made of a difference? I'm not sure, because as you put in a new aircraft, you're going to scale down production of another aircraft. And for a certain period of time, you're going to have a vacuum in terms of how many aircraft actually coming out of the production lines. And that's going to also leave you vulnerable. So initially with the 109s, I mean, that's why it was kept into production. It was just extremely efficient to build it. And as a side note, I mean, the Germans, for example, they go to Italy and they look at all the new fighter aircraft that are coming out in Italy, the 205, the G55, and so on, the Reggiani 2005 or something. And they look at these aircraft and they say, well, they're slightly better than the 109s, but they take twice the man hours to build, even if we ramp up production. So we're not going to use them. Also, they can't drop bombs, right? So they're very much focused on cranking out as many airframes as possible, and that was probably in the end the most, from a production standpoint and from a strategic standpoint, the most efficient way of handling things.
Yeah, I would add the 262 wasn't that good fighter, because I found a report, or not a report, Johannes Steinhoff, who was really a fighter ace, fought with the 262, and he wasn't able to kill some Soviet fighters like the Yak-9, because it was a bad turner, and it couldn't turn with all the conventional propeller airplanes, and this was a problem. So the 262 was well suited against American bombers to fight against American bombers, but it was not well suited against fighters. That's one problem. The other problem is there is an excellent study of, I think, Hermione Gifford about making jet engines in World War II, and she compared British, American and German jet engines developments. And she turned it a little bit around, because at first she looks at the production, not at the development. And so it turned out that in 1940, the nation which was most eager to develop jet engines were the British. Why? Because they were desperate at this time because of the Battle of Britain, at least a little bit desperate, not complete desperate, but at least a little bit. Afterwards they said, oh, we can win this war with the conventional engines, so we don't need to put so much energy into the jet engines. And the same is for the Germans. When they were winning, they had not really that big interest in jet engines, but at the end of the war, of course, they had. And this was always, so jet engines in World War II were, I say it a little bit short, it's not that simple, were a little bit an expression of desperation, because the situation seems to be bad when it comes to the Britain, or was really bad when it comes to the Germans in 1944, and so they tried to solve this problem, again, technological with jet engines, but it wouldn't have made the difference that much, I would say. Yeah.
Another great question and answer. So there's,
Thanks very much. Thank you both for your insights. It's really interesting to hear from your perspective. And thanks also for chairing the meeting. My question is around modern RAF now, for good or for bad. Still maintains the squadron names and even names aircraft after the Second World War. My question is around the German for today. What's their learnings from what happened before, and what have they taken forward, or what are they proud of today?
I mean, what is there to be proud of?
I would just say in short, then you can answer. There is not really any research about this. We have one study in Germany, a historian, PhD, who deals with the procurement of technology of the German Air Force in the 1980s. This is a really excellent study, unfortunately only available in German yet. And it shows a little bit the chaos at this time with all the other nations. When it comes to the Eurofighter, because first the French were in, and then they lost the interest because they had a fight with the British about how the airplane should be, and the Germans, they had no interest. They just followed the majority of the nations, So, but we don't know that much, to be honest, I would say, from a professional academical research standpoint. So all of this would be a point of view which wouldn't help, I would assume.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, you can maybe look at also the debate in Germany with surrounding sort of the airfield bases and what sort of names they have. And some of them were named after fighter aces from the Second World War, who were also then, of course, reintegrated into the West German Luftwaffe afterwards. And that's a little bit of a controversial subject sometimes in Germany. But one of the things that with the Eurofighter, of course, in the UK, it's known as the Typhoon. Everybody just refers to it as a Typhoon. Germans always say Eurofighter. That's what it's called. And we don't necessarily have sort of this, I think also this culture of naming them after past aircraft, because anything could be slightly controversial, of course.
Do you gentlemen think that the Luftwaffe ever really seriously considered the development and use of a four-engine bomber?
I mean, the Heinkel 177 is a four-engine bomber, right? Just looks like it's a two-engine one. They did sort of, initially in the 1930s, of course, they were looking into building these aircraft, but they don't necessarily cancel it because they say, well, what we have with medium bombers is good enough, but they say, like, well, we don't really have the capacity to build them just yet, and we're going to shelve those projects for the future. And that's why Germany starts out with no heavy bomber. They would have built them if they could have, but with the buildup of the Air Force, you needed to crank out numbers, and for every large four-engine bomber, you could crank out two smaller ones. So I think at the end of the war, perhaps there was a period. I think you maybe looked at this a little bit more.
Yeah, I could maybe.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Okay, I would say yes. They developed two types in the mid of the 30s, the DO-19 and the U-89. But the problem was the DO-19 was really bad, and the U-89 was 10% less in performance than the B-17, which was already on the stage at this time. And they recognized another problem, and this is the precision of level bombing, because the Americans at this time really thought they would hit, I don't know if you know the term, the fish bottle, fish, right, okay. They really thought they can do this, and the Germans were not so convinced about this, and that's the reason why they were so eager on developing a dive bomber, to make a better precision. Maybe some would say typical German, to have a higher precision, and. But of course, this was also not the solution on this, and that's the reason why the Heinkel 177 was this big failure, and Jeschonek, he was at the test squadron that developed dive bombing for the level bombers of the German Luftwaffe. So he was really important man, much more than Udet, I would say, behind U-88 and Heinkel 177. But and there's another thing I have to say regarding the fourth engine bomber. The Germans thought their twin engine would be enough for this task. So this is also one reason why they thought they could afford some time to develop this. Especially the U-88, which was also a little bit feared by the RAF. I have one quota from Dowding regarding the U-88. They overestimated the U-88 much.
Well, there we have it, ladies and gentlemen. Time is up, which is a great shame, but I think I've achieved the aim, which is, we've all learned something new in the last few minutes. It will go away and make us think, want to read a lot more, and that is because of our two excellent speakers, Christoph and Jens. Thank you both. So they're both with us for a while. If they're not mobbed in the next few minutes, I won't have done my job properly. So thank you both very much indeed, and thank you.